At 17, they stood in a silent house that no longer felt like home, with the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel heavier. And on the table between them lay a thin envelope with $20 inside, the last thing their father had hidden away, the last proof that someone once tried to protect them. And outside the window, winter was already taking over, the sky pale and merciless, the wind cutting through the trees like it had no patience for weakness. And that was the moment everything became real, because there were no more voices in the house, no footsteps, no guidance, no one to tell them what to do next. Just two sisters staring at a number so small, it almost felt like a joke. $20 to survive a winter that had already begun. $20 to replace a life that had just disappeared. And if you think that sounds impossible, you're right, because it was. And that's exactly why their story didn't start with hope. It started with fear. The kind of fear that doesn't scream, but sits quietly in your chest and asks one simple question again and again. What now? What now? What now? And the truth is, most people in that moment would wait. They would hope someone comes. They would accept whatever help appears. But help came with a price they were not willing to pay, because the town didn't offer them a future together. It offered separation, different homes, different lives, a slow and quiet way of losing each other. And after losing everything else, that was the one thing they refused to lose. So they said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, firm decision that changed everything. They packed almost nothing because they had almost nothing, stepped outside into the cold that immediately bit through their clothes, and walked away from the only place they had ever known. Not because they were brave, but because staying meant becoming something they didn't recognize, and leaving at least gave them a chance. Even if that chance looked like nothing more than a long road disappearing into snow and wind. Hours passed as they walked with no clear destination, their hands numb, their feet heavy, every step harder than the last, until the town behind them became smaller and the world ahead of them became quieter, emptier, more uncertain. And that's when they saw it. Not a house, not really, more like a memory of one. A structure half buried in snow, wood cracked and tired, roof bent like it had given up years ago. A door that didn't quite close. The kind of place most people would walk past without even considering. But they didn't have the luxury of options. They had $20 and a winter that didn't care about their situation. So they stepped closer, pushed the door open, felt the cold air rush inside like it already owned the place, and made a decision that would define everything that came next. They bought it. Every dollar gone in a single moment, traded for walls that barely stood and a roof that barely held. And that night, reality hit in a way nothing else had before. Because it's one thing to imagine struggle, and another to sit inside it, to feel the cold crawl through every gap, to hear the wind move through the cracks like it's reminding you that you don't belong here. They gathered broken pieces of wood, scraps, anything they could find, lit a small fire that flickered more than it burned, and sat close together, not just for warmth, but because being close made the fear a little quieter. They didn't talk much because there wasn't much to say. Everything important had already happened, and everything ahead of them was unknown. Sleep came in short, restless moments, interrupted by cold, by hunger, by the constant awareness that this was now their life. And mourning didn't bring relief. It brought reality in full light. The walls looked worse, the roof looked weaker, and their situation looked exactly as difficult as it felt. They searched for anything useful, any leftover supplies, anything that could help them survive even a few more days. But there was almost nothing. And hunger doesn't wait politely. It doesn't give you time to figure things out. It demands action. So they went back to the town they had just left, not with pride, but with necessity, asking for work, any work. And the reactions were exactly what you would expect. Doubt, hesitation, sometimes pity, sometimes indifference. Because two teenagers offering labor in a place where adults were already struggling didn't seem like a solution to anyone. But they didn't stop. They cleaned floors, carried heavy loads, fixed small broken things they barely understood, anything that paid even a little. And every coin they earned felt like a step forward, even if that step was painfully small. Days blurred into each other, cold mornings, long hours, empty evenings. And still, it wasn't enough. Some nights they ate, some nights they didn't. Some days they questioned whether they had made the worst decision of their lives. And that question grew louder every time something went wrong, which was often. Because when you start with nothing, every mistake costs more. Every failure hits harder. And then came one of those days that changes everything. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's clear. Eliza noticed something simple, something most people ignored. The town wasn't lacking effort. It was lacking solutions. People complained constantly about small things. No warm food during long work hours, not enough candles to get through the night, tools that broke and stayed broken because no one had time to fix them. Small problems everywhere. And small problems, when they repeat enough, become big opportunities. That night in their freezing shelter, she said it out loud, not as a grand idea, but as a quiet thought. What if we stop looking for work and start fixing what people actually need? Catherine didn't respond immediately because the idea sounded risky, maybe even unrealistic, but it also sounded different. And different was exactly what they needed. The next day they tried, not perfectly, not confidently, but intentionally. They cooked the simplest meals they could manage, nothing special, just warm, affordable, something people could grab quickly. And they offered it, not as a favor, not as a request, but as a solution. And people bought. Not many at first, just enough to notice. Enough to prove that the idea had something real behind it. That small success shifted something inside them, because for the first time, they weren't just trading time for money. They were creating value, something that could grow. Nights became workshops, melting wax, shaping candles, experimenting with whatever materials they could find. Days became opportunities, selling food, offering repairs, listening carefully to what people needed, and adjusting constantly. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't efficient, and it definitely wasn't easy. There were failures, batches of food that didn't sell, candles that broke, repairs that didn't work, and every failure felt expensive because they had so little room for error. But they kept going. Refining, improving, learning faster than they ever had before. Their first real profit, $5, didn't change their situation overnight, but it changed their mindset completely, because it proved something simple and powerful. They could create income, not just earn it. And that difference is everything. But just as things started to feel stable, life reminded them how fragile stability can be. A storm hit without warning, stronger than anything they had experienced. Wind forcing its way through every weakness in their shelter, snow pouring in, part of the roof collapsing under pressure, supplies ruined, hard-earned money spent on repairs instead of growth. It felt like losing everything again. Sitting in the dark, surrounded by damage, the idea of quitting felt logical, almost reasonable. Because how many times can you start over before you accept that maybe it's not meant to work? But they didn't quit. Not because they were fearless, but because they understood something deeper now. Quitting wouldn't just end their struggle. It would erase everything they had built, every lesson, every small victory, every step forward. So they chose the harder path. Again. Rebuild, adapt, continue. They reinforced their shelter, improved their process, became more careful with money, more strategic with effort. And slowly, almost quietly, things began to change. Customers returned, not out of sympathy, but because the value was real. Word spread, not loudly, but steadily, and their small operation started to grow into something that resembled a business. Not perfect, not large, but consistent. And consistency is what builds trust. Months passed, seasons shifted slightly, and the place that once felt like a temporary survival point started to feel like a base, a foundation, something they could actually build from. They expanded their offerings, improved quality, increased efficiency, learned to manage time and resources better, and with every improvement, their confidence grew. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you survived worse and kept going. Eventually, they reached a point where the next step became clear. They needed a space in town, a place where customers could come to them instead of the other way around. It was a risk, bigger than anything they had taken before, because it required commitment, money, and belief in something that wasn't guaranteed. But they had come too far to stay small, so they did it. They opened a small shop, simple, modest, but real. A place that represented every decision, every sacrifice, every night spent in the cold. And people came, not just once, but again and again, because the value was consistent, the effort was visible, and the story, even if unspoken, was felt. Years passed, and what started as survival became growth, and what started as growth became success. Not overnight, not easily, but steadily, built on every small step they refused to skip. Catherine and Eliza were no longer the girls with $20 and a broken shelter. They were business owners, leaders, examples of what happens when persistence meets opportunity. And the most important part of their story isn't the money they eventually made or the business they built. It's the decision they made at the very beginning, when everything was uncertain, when fear was louder than hope, when the easier path was to accept separation and safety. But they chose something harder, something riskier, something that didn't guarantee success, but allowed the possibility of it. And that choice, more than anything else, is what changed their lives. Because most people wait for a moment that feels right, for help that feels certain, for a path that looks clear. But sometimes the only way forward is to move anyway. To take what little you have and turn it into something more, step by step, failure by failure, until one day you look back and realize that what once felt impossible is now your reality. And it all started with $20, a broken shelter, and a decision not to give up.